Welcome to the Leadership Genius podcast. I'm your host, Jason Diamond Arnold, and it's been a while since we've posted a podcast for Leadership Genius. In fact, unfortunately, we only had one Leadership Genius podcast post in 2024. And a couple reasons for that is that the software that we were using for that podcast got bought by Spotify. So there was a lot of issues transferring over everything over to that. Fortunately, the podcasts that we've produced in the past are still there, but we lost a lot of content that we had already pre-recorded, and then it's learning a new system. And the reason why that's taken a while is because we've been very busy with Inspire software. Inspire supports the Leadership Genius podcast. Leadership Genius is a leadership curriculum that is built into Inspire software, which is a business tech platform that helps companies create strategy and then execute that strategy through goals or OKRs, a goal setting methodology, into performance with leadership development as part of it. Leadership Genius language is part of that. Welcome back. It's been a while. One of the things that we consistently try to do on Leadership Genius is to create ongoing conversations about leadership, whether it's about events, leadership trends in the workplace, whether it's leadership research that we've been doing, or leadership theories that we investigate. How does this play out in workplaces? How does it play out in your hometown that you're in? How does it play out nationally, internationally? How does it play out in your home? So the Leadership Genius podcast was created to have ongoing conversations about different aspects and truly the evolution of leadership in the 21st century. And so this month, for January of 2025, there's been two major leadership sort of teaching moments that I just want to briefly discuss as we reset this podcast this year. And one of it has to do with the inauguration of a new president in the United States and that transition of power. And then shortly after what happened, which we'll talk about in terms of the flurry of executive orders that were signed by the new president. And then the other major event, ironically on the same day as the inauguration, was the celebration and birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which I think creates a lot of opportunities to talk about leadership and his approach to leadership and the lessons that we can learn from that. First, let's talk about the inauguration of Donald J. Trump in his second term that just took place in January 2025. And just as a reminder, what we don't do is we don't get into the platforms of leaders, or we could have discussions about values and things like that, but I don't want to go down the political path, or we don't want to go down the political path in this podcast. We want to kind of talk about leadership trends that you see enacted. So if we talk about a political leader, or we talk about an executive leader, or we talk about a leader within an organization, or any other type of leader, we're not really addressing what their political views are. We're just kind of talking about the leadership traits or leadership trends that you see from that leader. One of the interesting things that I gleaned from the inauguration was this idea of transferring power from one executive and that executive's team being the cabinet of the chief executive officer of the United States or the commander-in-chief of the United States, transitioning that over to another one. And this year it was pretty seamless. I know there was controversy in 2021. I don't really want to get into that either because it's a sensitive topic. I think it's worth addressing. It's just not our focus here. So when I watched the inauguration, I was just really amazed that there is this constitution that has set up and designed a smooth transfer from one executive to another executive, and you just don't really see that a lot in not only countries but in organizations. If there's a change in leadership at the executive level, especially the chief executive officer, it can be a tumultuous time. It can be a very challenging situation. So one of the things that I'm fascinated about is the design of the founders and framers of the Constitution to, one, limit terms of presidents. So the context of this was George Washington served 2 terms and then stepped down voluntarily and gave that executive authority to another president that was then voted by the people. So I was very interested in that. Now, on that same day, we saw something that's really unprecedented in terms of presidents taking office, and you hear a lot about day one, I will do this. Well, Donald Trump jumped right into signing executive orders, and some of it was new executive orders, some of it was reversing executive orders of the previous administration. And again, not to get into the policies or the content of what the executive orders were, but just to focus on the concept of the executive decision. So we hear that a lot in business. I had to make an executive decision, or you even hear it at home. He or she made an executive decision. That means like you had to go around the collaboration process, or you went around the collaboration process where you had to build consensus, which takes time and is really challenging in its own right, into just signing an executive order and making an executive decision saying that this is going to happen. Now, it's debatable whether all of those executive orders were constitutional. It's debatable whether that is the best approach. There's pros and cons to presidents just signing executive orders. So what I really wanted to do was kind of think about that concept. When you, as a leader, have executive powers, if you will, or you have executive authority to make a decision, one of the challenges is to suspend that authority and be able to then to go collaborate and make a collective decision to determine the direction of the organization or the country or the family. And so I just think it's an interesting concept to think about. If you have authority and you have decision-making authority, how do you exercise that authority? My one of my mentors, Dr. Kim Blanchard, is used to talk about his father, who was an admiral in the Navy, and Ken had run for student government when he was in 7th grade, or when he was in junior high, or somewhere in his youth, and he got elected to it. And his father, who was an admiral in the Navy, said to him, now your greatest lesson, Ken, is now that you have authority, is learning how to not use it. In other words, just because you have authority doesn't mean that the process of trying to influence and collaborate and create a consensus decision making still remains very, very important to leadership practices. Now, that being said, there are moments of urgency where executive decisions need to be made, whether it's in business or, whether it's in the military and there's a combat situation and there has to be a direction given immediately to address a crisis or an emergency. So it's understandable that the concept exists, but it's also interesting to think on the flip side of it too, is just because you have the executive authority, is it in the best interest of everyone that you're leading or influencing to be able to make those executive decisions? Just an interesting thought. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section. Please be respectful when you do leave comments, and please keep the conversation focused on leadership behaviors versus attacks on personal character and getting into political discussions about ideology. I mean, I think it's great. I love talking politics. I love the concept of politics and debating ideas and concepts. But again, the focus is on the leadership traits here. Then, just to conclude this podcast, I wanted to acknowledge that this is we just celebrated Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, and it's a great opportunity every year to remember the leadership traits that Dr. King exhibited in his leadership of the civil rights movement in the late 50s and 1960s in the United States. And it's an interesting time to think about it, because on that day of inauguration, it was interesting to reflect on Martin Luther King Jr.'s impact as a social figure. You have to remember that Martin Luther King Jr. was a preacher at a Baptist church and really didn't have any political authority or political power to make changes, but seized an opportunity in Alabama when there was a boycott of the bus system because of the Rosa Parks incident. Was sort of an inciting incident that really sparked the civil rights movement, and Dr. King stepped into action and began to organize civil rights protests using civil disobedience, nonviolent protests. Really, when you think about the civil rights movement under or with the strong leadership of Dr. King, not only in organizing that movement and helping organize that movement, but in his oral rhetoric in terms of his passion, his influence, his articulation of what the movement was about. The I Have a Dream speech, which is probably his most famous speech, that took place in 1963, outlining a vision for what the movement was about. So when I think of Dr. Martin Luther King, one of the things that I admire about his leadership, and I think it's valuable for us, is it's that contrast to having executive leadership and be able to just by a stroke of a pen make a change, versus having no political position but organizing a movement and groups of people and inspiring a vision to move the country in this context, or move people in a certain direction to make a positive change, to make a change that's necessary for the greater good of society, or the greater good of an organization, or greater good of your family. So those are two key takeaways that ironically happened, probably three takeaways that happened all really in one day. The inauguration and transfer of power between one president to another, the signing of executive orders, a flurry of executive orders, and then the leadership legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts about, as you think about leadership in January of 2025, moving forward this year, or just where we're at in the 21st century? What are your thoughts about the use of power and being able to influence people either by the stroke of a pen or organizing movements to make lasting change? Welcome back to the Leadership Genius podcast. We'd love for you to like and subscribe to us, send this out, and have people join the conversation. We're looking forward to starting back things, just resetting the table and the topic on the conversation of leadership. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to hearing and seeing you in the next episode of the Leadership Genius podcast.